You tend to torment him with his trip to Kamloops and other things like that, but we won't get into any of that sort of stuff. What was I going to say about this particular thing? Oh, yes, the title. It comes from The Brute Force, I think, which was a film you watched at the time with Burt Lancaster. Is that not how you got the title?
I did that. That's interesting because I don't think I mentioned it overtly. Yes, I had the idea of that. It came to me after watching it. I wanted to use a very film noir kind of title, and so I was thinking, but I actually had gotten and written down a line, the brute reality of death, because when I was thinking about the Stacey Stafford real character and all her near-death experience bullshit, people like this, and also arguing with people about religion on Twitter or elsewhere, it's like, grow the fuck up. The brute reality of life is that there's death and there's nothing after it. That just like you weren't around in 1850, you're not going to be around in 2250. That's the reality. Deal with it. And I just thought, the brute reality made, the brute material reality. The brute material is just a good 3-line. It has that punchy effect, and then by having that, so having that film noir title, and then the trial of Stacey Stafford, it leads someone to thinking that this is going to be a courtroom drama too.
Since you mentioned her dumb blonde moments, I have to mention my favorite, which is not even with Danny Wagner, but with the disembodied voice, and we'll get to that aspect of Lana Brown and that quote-unquote character of the play later, but she's speaking about how Danny has taught her so much, and she says this wonderful line, and I learned about Walt Whitman. Do you know he was a person?
Yeah.
And the disembodied voice, who I always thought, because the Stacey Stafford character is a similar, although different kind of insanity, it could be partly maybe Stacey Stafford coming in from the void and speaking to Lana. I know that she has more fidelity to Lana, but the disembodied voice also has this quality of an independence. And maybe it's just because I know internally my consciousness is often ahead of where I am in reality. Yeah. It's something that instinctually you have to follow, especially if you're an artist, because it's often smarter than where you are if you try to force it.
And I do say, though, that right in the beginning of the play, the disembodied voice is neither male nor female, or it's indeterminate. So we don't know if it's a female voice or a male voice, which allows that you could have, perhaps a voice actor, one performance be male and then be female the next. And that would, this allows for different interpretations. Because if we say Lana Brown has a projection of herself out into the cosmos where she's talking to herself, and it's a male projection, that's interesting. It's more interesting than if it's just a female voice. Or is that male voice a projection of Danny Wagner? Or one of Lana's former lovers that has rattling about her heads, just like Jacob Marley in the Scrooge Christmas Carol. Who knows?
This is sort of why greatness is complexity, because you were speaking about how, you use these prose blocks that sort of stack upon each other and form this more complex piece of architecture. I think you have a quality of your writing that's very difficult to quote you. It's not to say that you're not quotable, but I've noticed with certain writers, they may have a great line here or there, but your stuff, it almost needs to be quoted in blocks, because it doesn't make sense necessarily excerpting a line or two from it.
Excerpting, not excerpting. But anyway, that's true. And one of the things that you will notice, though, is if you were, and I think I've talked about this.
Dude, before you go on, one of my peeves in poetry is quoting Walt Whitman, because people tend to quote a great image or one or two great images from, say, Song of Myself or I Sing the Electric, what have you. And Walt Whitman can only really be appreciated in his complexity. There are some great philosophical lines that he has in his poems, but you have a similar quality. You mentioned it earlier on when you were speaking, but you have a similar quality with Walt Whitman in that it has to be appreciated through the whole and not through just a single strand of it.
And if you were to quote, say, a paragraph of mine, that the character, or a monologue where a character is talking that they are, say, against this certain viewpoint philosophically or religiously, within that rant or that monologue that's against it, you could find one or two quotes, just a sentence you could pull out that seems to argue the opposite. And that's one of the things. So that's why if you were to quote, say, just a one sentence excerpt, and someone was to say, see, I'm going to quote Dan Schneider, this is in support of it, someone else could come online and say, no, but you took that out of context, because if you have the whole paragraph, it's clear that he's arguing against that. And that gives you that almost biblical kind of thing where it depends on how fine you want to read the point. And it's often why, not that I don't take stands, I do take stands. I often have very deep and sharp and clear political or philosophical convictions that come through that are Dan Schneider's. But the characters have to be a bit more equivocal, because you don't want a bunch of zealots just spouting speeches. It has to be more subtle. And I can argue, I can have a character maybe give a far more convincing argument in favor or against something that I'm in favor of, than the character whose viewpoint is really Dan Schneider's opinion. But that's good, because I'm not writing a speech. I'm not on a stump trying to sell myself as a candidate in a political contest. I'm an artist trying to put something forth, and it's more important for me to have you learn about your own view of something, than for me to say, oh, it's A, B, and C, and that's obvious.